morning, everybody. Well, it is good to be here and certainly to be in much drier, warmer weather. Obviously, things were a little exciting in Florida last week, and I'm sure there's several of you that were in the middle of all that too, but we came through well. And the good news is KSC is open for business. We got everybody back to work on Tuesday, and we're moving right along. It's a real pleasure to talk with you today, though, about where things are headed with the use of our national infrastructure by the commercial space companies. You know, from a historical perspective, there's been a good trend through history of government investment and how that has benefited the overall economy and benefited those commercial companies that look to leverage that investment to move forward. You see three examples up here on the charts. Transcontinental railways, where the government had essentially put out 30-year bonds to encourage the private sector to build and continue those railways into a transcontinental railroad across the country. And I've seen numbers as high as $1 billion in the first year in today's dollars that was moved along those lines that very first time. Certainly a huge economic impact, both financially as well as the development of cities and settlements all the way out to the West Coast and the movement of many people. Similar examples with the interstate highway systems, and with those being put in place, we connected the larger cities to the smaller cities, and that certainly had a lot of economic benefit as well. And the electrical utilities, you can go back to the city of New York, putting a contract in place with the Edison Light Company to begin to light that city, and certainly the lighting of America and around the world that followed thereafter had huge economic impact. So my point to you this morning is the huge investment that we have made over the many years in the national infrastructure, particularly in the area of space testing and operations, is really supporting very well the advancement of commercial space. And I'll give you a few examples of those companies that are moving forward utilizing that infrastructure. Here's the first example. Just recently here at White Sands test facilities, Aerojet Rocketdyne did some testing of the thrusters that they're under contract to deliver to Boeing for the CST-100 Starliner. They utilized one of the test cells here. You can see the details on the engine test there. And make special note of the fact that this was really a record in terms of lightweight thrusters utilizing composite chambers. So I'm sure many of you have heard about a lot of the advances in additive manufacturing and the new materials that are working their way into this industry and the benefits of this. And here's a case where the national infrastructure was used to shatter some records in performance there with those Aerojet Rocketdyne engines. Taking it out to KSC, those engines will then be assembled into the Starliner by Boeing, and they're utilizing the previously named Orbiter Processing Facility number 3. Those of you that recall the shuttle days will recall there were 3 orbiter processing facilities there at Kennedy, and one of those is now being used exclusively by Boeing for commercial purposes. This was an effort that where NASA had basically put in place with the Space Florida state agency there in Florida, an agreement to reach out to commercial customers that possibly could utilize that facility and for commercial purposes. Boeing took them up on that, and that has transitioned over, and that is where they are holding their commercial crew and cargo processing facility for the Starliner. So the previous test, those engines will be headed out to Kennedy at some point, and those will be integrated in with their vehicle in that facility at KSC. Some further testing by Aerojet Rocketdyne, their AR-1 engine was done recently at Stennis. This was the pre-burner testing that they did for those engines. You can see the complex that was utilized there and a picture of the test there. There was also some work done previous to that at Marshall Space Flight Center with the pre-burner hot fire testing. Now, I want to make particular note here of the fact that they used hardware that was fabricated utilizing additive manufacturing. Our team there at Marshall is not only engaged in supporting the test needs of our NASA customer, but they're also very involved in moving the technologies forward. And additive manufacturing is certainly an area that they're very engaged with. So we were very pleased to provide support in that way to this activity. Again, the AR-1 engine, if you're not familiar, is one of a couple of engines being looked at for utilization in the ULA Vulcan rocket. It's also obviously an engine that's being built and put forward as a replacement for the RD-180. Certainly an important test there, utilizing a couple of test centers and the national infrastructure expertise that came with those centers. As a result of that, Aerojet Rocketdyne is now expanding their Stennis presence with their center of excellence there in the area of large liquid rocket engines. They're going to be assembling and testing the AR-1 at that location. They've also moved their RS-25 low-pressure turbopump assembly activities there, and previously, and it continues to be home for assembly and testing of the RS-68 for the Delta IV as well. So certainly they're leveraging not only the test facilities in the infrastructure, but the area there to locate their operations for testing and assembly as well. Great utilization there. Moving on to another example, SpaceX. You've seen in the news probably recently, and perhaps many of you were there a couple of weeks ago as Elon Musk detailed his plans for moving toward Mars and the future of the technology that they've built up so far with that company. The Raptor engine, as you know, if you've seen those discussions, is key to that. And early on, as early as a couple years ago, they signed an agreement with NASA for some testing of that engine at the E2 test stand at Stennis. Quite a bit of maintenance and test stand modifications were required, so that was a true public-private partnership there where NASA made some additional investment in that infrastructure and SpaceX benefited from that with the opportunity to then move forward with that testing. They've also done some main injector testing and full power testing of their pre-burner components. And this was a real milestone that Stennis brought forward where this was really a true private industry need. It wasn't linked to a specific NASA program of any kind. It was a true private company desire and commercial use, and certainly a step forward there as they utilized that infrastructure. I might also mention that when those engines are ready to go, Elon has indicated at least recently that they will likely be using Pad 39A at KSC for launching that interplanetary transport system, as they're calling it now. Currently, SpaceX has a lease with the NASA folks at KSC for use of that pad. They're getting everything ready for launch with Falcon Heavy and the future Falcon 9 crewed launches as well. So that's yet another example where they're utilizing on one side some test capabilities at other locations, and then at KSC utilizing a previously used shuttle test or launch pad that's now been converted over for commercial use. And that is actually a 20-year lease they have in place with NASA. So a great example, again, of leveraging infrastructure to move your goal forward. In addition to testing, I might mention, if you're not real familiar with Jacobs, we're located at most of the NASA centers. We do a lot of work with DoD, Air Force, and many of the services as well. But in addition to supporting testing, launch operations, all those aspects of the business, we also do a lot of training. And we've really seen an uptick, particularly with our folks here at White Sands, in training and analysis support to commercial companies. Many of these folks are utilizing not only the national infrastructure, but their own infrastructure that they're building as well, that's complementary to that. And often some of these folks are newer to the business of testing engines, as well as some of the other aspects that come with the risks of launching rockets. And so we've provided quite a bit of training there for those folks on an as-needed basis. You can see a list of some of the companies we've either supported so far or will in the near future as discussions move forward. You can also see on the bottom of this slide some of the different analysis and testing that we've supported from this location as well. So again, with the investment in our national infrastructure, we need to think about more than just the facilities and the hardware and the instrumentation and everything that gets put in place with that. It's also the people, the expertise that's at each of those locations. And this is a huge benefit to leverage that deep, many years of experience from those folks at each of those facilities, particularly as new companies get into this business, perhaps for the very first time. So certainly that's another strength that folks can draw from the national infrastructure as well. Looking a little more broadly, Blue Origin is certainly looking at constructing their New Glenn manufacturing facility. You've probably seen the news on that, just outside the fence at Kennedy Space Center. This is utilizing an area that's part of what they call Exploration Park, which is actually some area, land and some facilities that KSC transitioned over to Space Florida to then reach out to these commercial customers to offer those capabilities. They will be launching their orbital vehicle from there, and they have an agreement and lease in place for Launch Complex 36. They've also discussed doing some engine testing at KSC, so looking to see some activity in that area potentially in the near future with their BE-4 engine, the other competitor for the Vulcan, as well as certainly a very strong part of their overall rocket system too. They're also looking at doing launch vehicle integration and of course launch operations there as well. So that's another aspect of, again, another commercial company utilizing that national infrastructure. Supporting Sierra Nevada, we've done a fair amount of development and qualification work for their thermal protection system materials for the Dream Chaser spacecraft. And they've also utilized the facilities at NASA Ames and JSC for testing of those materials as well. So they are certainly a great partner with many NASA locations in this national infrastructure too. And of course, with the Antares challenges that Orbital ATK encountered a couple of years ago, they came down to KSC to utilize the Atlas V for a couple of launches and took advantage of the processing capabilities that we had at KSC as well. A great example where they really had some very tight schedule constraints that they needed to meet while they got Antares back up and going and getting Wallops recovered from that accident. And we were very pleased to support them there, and I think they found equal, if not additional support that they could draw from the infrastructure through that avenue as well. I mentioned Space Florida. If you're not familiar, they are the state agency for Florida that's designed to try to draw in and maintain that commercial sector in this business within the state of Florida. They are utilizing Exploration Park, as I mentioned before, specifically the old Space Life Sciences lab building. They have some offices in there as well as lab space that they provide to a variety of commercial customers. And then as I mentioned earlier, Blue Origin and also a company called OneWeb are building manufacturing facilities in that area as well. So that area is really another piece that's being addressed as part of the national infrastructure. There's more discussions in terms of VAB High Bay 2 with another company to utilize that for their rocket. And an additional approach that NASA has taken recently, which I find particularly interesting, is looking at land on these facilities as a resource for the national infrastructure that commercial folks can draw from. Putting out a notice of availability, KSC has offered land, particularly for the use of vertical launch sites or similar facilities that would support that type of activity, and they're in discussions with several companies that have interest in that as well. I'm almost out of time here, so let me hit manufacturing just very quickly. In addition to the engineering, testing, instrumentation, and all those different aspects that Jacob support, we also do quite a bit of support to the manufacturing industry across a lot of different industries. Particularly one of the examples would be automotive. We have a long history working with the Ford Motor Company. We've transitioned a lot of best practices, and we really look upstream and downstream in terms of the type of support we can provide there. That may be yet another resource, that expertise and assistance, that as many of these commercial companies move forward to build manufacturing facilities that they can draw from as well in support of that activity. So to wrap up, let me say in summary, we are open for business, and our national infrastructure in general is certainly there, ready and waiting for use by the commercial space companies. It's a significant investment with a lot of expertise, a lot of great facilities, and I think you've seen a few examples this morning of where commercial space is really leveraging that investment to move their activities forward. I would certainly love to see a lot more of that as time goes on, and we're in discussions with many of these new companies about different ways that we can support them in the future. With that, I am concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.